अब हम रुख करते हैं उस खित्ते का कि जिसका नाम है खित्ता फ़लस्तीन। और आज ज़रा फ़लस्तीन की तारीख़ की बात करेंगे, लेकिन फ़लस्तीन की तारीख़ का सबक पढ़ाने के लिए आज हमारे साथ जो ख़ास मेहमान मौजूद हैं वो एक यहूदी हैं, और एक ऐसे यहूदी हैं जिन्होंने फ़लस्तीन की तारीख़ को पढ़ा और फ़लस्तीन की तारीख़ पर उनका PhD है, और वो हमें बताएंगे कि बुनियादी तौर पर फ़लस्तीन की तारीख़ है क्या, और फिर ये जो फ़लस्तीन के ख़ित्ते में इसराइल का क़याम अमल में लाया गया है ये कितना ज़्यादा मोहलिक है और दुनिया किस तरीके से इससे नुकसान उठा रही है। हमारे साथ मौजूद हैं जी डॉक्टर ज़ैकरी फॉस्टर, जो कि पैलेस्टीनियन हिस्ट्री के एक्सपर्ट हैं। उनसे हम इस बारे में बात करते हैं। हेलो डॉक्टर ज़ैकरी फॉस्टर, थैंक यू फॉर गिविंग अस योर टाइम।
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So, Dr. Zach, you've studied the history of Palestine, you've studied the history of Israel. Let's start with history. So, we all know that this land of Palestine, this was allotted to the Israelis, and one sudden day the United Nations decided that Jews will go and live in this area, in the heart of this area, and this land actually belongs to someone else. How do you see this whole thing done by the United Nations?
That's exactly correct. Exactly correct. So in 1947, the United Nations passed the infamous partition plan in November, calling for Jewish and Arab states in Palestine. Now, the problem was that the Jewish state would be roughly 55% of the land of Palestine, even though Jews were only 33% of the population and they only owned 6% of the land. Meanwhile, the Palestinian state, the Arab state, would be only 45% of British Mandatory Palestine, for 2/3 of the population who owned the vast majority of the land. You can do the math on whether or not you think that partition plan made sense, but of course the Arabs rejected it as anti-democratic and as unjust, because they were the indigenous inhabitants of the land who had lived there for many, many centuries. And just because the British set up a mandate, quote unquote, which was effectively an anti-democratic regime that that did not factor into its rule the wishes of the native population. And so after 30 years of anti-democratic British rule, then the United Nations said, after we've encouraged tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Jews to migrate to Palestine against the will of the native population, that then they then proposed a state for that settler population. So that is the reason why I think the partition plan of 1947 was fundamentally unjust.
Okay, yes, and this 55% of the land that was allotted to the Jews by United Nations, it's kind of an ever expanding in nature, because we see that the Israelis, they are committing atrocities against the Palestinians. They are capturing their land on a daily basis. They are building settlements. So what exactly are they looking forward to? What exactly are the Zionists trying to do in this area of Palestine, let's say in the next 10 years?
Well, what we've been witnessing since October of 2024 is the final phase of the ethnic cleansing of North Gaza. We knew already from October 2023, already a year ago, that Israel had plans to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip. There was a think tank associated with the Israeli military that released a 25-page PDF outlining the goal, which was to completely rid North Gaza of its Palestinian inhabitants. In other words, carry out a plan of ethnic cleansing. And over the past month and a half, that's exactly what the Israeli military has done in Beit Lahia and Jabalia, in the north of the Gaza Strip. They are going door to door and either executing people on the spot. In fact, we have many reports of that happening, or forcing people out of their homes onto a perilous journey, although we pushed further south, where they'll then face more bombing and more shelling, and that's what we've been witnessing. And we know for a fact that this was the plan stated by Giora Island, the Israeli official who proposed the plan already months ago, and that's what the Israeli military is doing in North Gaza.
Okay, and one more thing. Whenever someone comes out and points out that Israel is not doing the right thing and Israel is ethnically cleansing these Palestinian people, that person is termed as an anti-Semite, and that term is being used quite often by people who support Israel. So why is that being done by others?
Well, the most potent accusation that Israel and its supporters levy against critics of the state of Israel is the charge of anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Because uh, if the Jewish state, if Israel's a Jewish state, and if you, therefore you attack Israel, well, you're attacking Jews, I guess. So that's sort of the logic of the argument. But of course, to assume that the Jewish people around the world who are citizens of any number of other states have anything to do with Israel, and then to accuse Jews and blame Jews for the crimes carried out by the state of Israel is itself anti-Semitic. So labeling people who attack Israel as anti-Semitic is itself anti-Semitic, because what you're saying is you're conflating Jews around the world with the actions of the state of Israel, which is deeply, deeply anti-Semitic. And so that is why these accusations are themselves incredibly problematic, and I would describe them as themselves anti-Semitic. And by the way, there's nothing new about these types of accusations. Israel has been labeling critics of the state anti-Semitic for decades, but here we are. I think part of the problem is that leaders, media pundits, everyone is fearful that they themselves will be labeled anti-Semitic and thus shunned and banned from civilized spaces, fired from their positions in the media or in politics. Everyone is fearful because no one wants to be labeled an anti-Semite.
Yes.
Because we all know the history of the Jews, and we all know that there have been horrific anti-Semitic acts in history perpetrated by many states. And so everyone's fearful of that, and Israel exploits that. Israel exploits that accusation in order to manufacture consent for a genocide.
And they have exploited this word to a level that everyone is afraid of this one single word. And this brings me to another word. That word is Zionism or Zionist, because there are so many people who confuse Jews with Zionists, and they don't realize that Zionism is a totally different agenda altogether. So what is the objective of Zionism?
Zionism was a movement that began in the 16th, 17th century among evangelical Protestants, primarily in England. And then at some point in the mid to late 19th century was embraced by Jews who believed that the solution to anti-Semitism in Europe was the establishment of a Jewish state in a land that was 95% non-Jewish. You can just imagine how that went. I mean, imagine you were one of those 95% of the people of Palestine who are non-Jewish. What would you have made of a movement of settlers moving to your country, intention of buying your land and evicting you from it because you were of the wrong religion, and then refusing to employ you because you were of the wrong religion, and then building institutions like labor unions, like healthcare systems, like education systems that excluded you, that denied you access to those labor unions and those healthcare institutions and those settler communities because, again, you were of the wrong religion. That was what Zionism was. It was a movement of Jews that said, let's create an exclusively Jewish state in a land that is overwhelmingly non-Jewish, with the ultimate aim of subjecting those non-Jews to the political rule of that Jewish community. And that's exactly what the Zionist community did. They established all these institutions. They built all these settlements. Again, exclusively Jewish settlements, exclusively Jewish institutions, exclusively Jewish paramilitary organizations, exclusively Jewish labor unions, ultimately with the goal of establishing institutions of a state that would then subject those non-Jews living in Palestine to rule from those Jewish entities. And then, of course, the problem was that the Zionist community failed to achieve demographic majority in the land on the eve of 1948. They were only about 1/3 of the population. And so what happened in 1948? They needed to ensure demographic majority. That's how you establish a Jewish state, right? You have a majority of Jews in the state. And so what did they do? They ethnically cleansed 750,000 Palestinians from Palestine in order to establish a Jewish supermajority. And of course, that story continues all the way to the present day. every single military encounter between Israel and the Palestinians involves Israel ethnically cleansing Palestinians. They did this in 67 when they ethnically cleansed another 250,000 Palestinians from Palestine. And 67 to 71, they ethnically cleansed another 70, 80, 90,000 Palestinians. And then from 1967 until 1993, Israel effectively prevented 250,000, I think actually more like 300,000 Palestinians who had left Palestine for a period of more than 3 years. They refused those Palestinians the right to return. So again, another 300,000 Palestinians on top of the 250,000 Palestinians they ethnically cleansed in 67 and shortly after, on top of the 750,000 Palestinians they ethnically cleansed in 48. And of course, that story continues all the way to the present day. In Gaza, over the past 18 years, Israel has been pushing Palestinians out slowly, but by suffocating the Gaza Strip, imposing a siege and a blockade on that strip over the past 17, 18 years, what has Israel done? It has pushed Palestinians out who either escape to Gaza, escape to Egypt under the tunnels, or board boats hoping for a better life in Europe. And so this has been the case now for 75 years. We have an ongoing process of trying to push Palestinians out of Palestine.
And now we are witnessing this whole ethnic cleansing and specifically genocide, that should be the right word. We are witnessing this genocide through social media, through the internet, and not on the mainstream media, not on the mainstream TV channels, except for one or two or a few. So people say that the whole Western media is controlled. How much of this thing is true?
Well, in December, was it January 2024, The Intercept published a study. The major media outlets in the United States, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, CNN, and what they determined was that even though during the first 6 weeks of the onslaught on Gaza, Israel had already killed 15 times more Palestinians than Palestinians had killed Israelis.
Yes.
The language used to describe this war was you have basically the word massacre is used 40 times to describe what the Palestinians did, and one time to describe what Israelis did, even though Israel had slaughtered 15 times as many Palestinians. And that's the nature of the coverage. It's overemphasizing the Israeli victims, undercovering, underreporting on the Palestinian victims. I mean, just look at CNN, Dana Bash, Jake Tapper, Wolf Blitzer, who all of whom are Zionists to their core, all of whom believe that their mission as journalists is to provide a cover fire and manufacture consent for Israel's genocidal onslaught in Gaza. I mean, it's obviously much worse in the right-wing media like Fox News, but even MSNBC, Joe Scarborough, these are Zionists to their core. The New York Times running headlines like, lives lost in Gaza. Well, how were the lives lost? Who killed them? This incessant usage of the passive tense whenever Israel is committing slaughters and massacres, never calling things ethnic cleansing, not even using the word refugee camp to describe a refugee camp. New York Times refusing to use the word genocide. These are orders passed down from the very top. Same is true of most of the mainstream media in the U.S., just absolutely complicit in this genocide. It's really remarkable, you could say. I mean, look down the line of people writing in the New York Times. Isabel Kirshner, her son, served in the Israeli military. Thomas Friedman, a lifelong committed Zionist. Basically everyone who writes for the New York Times is a Zionist. The leadership, the people who own the magazine, they're also Zionists. Same is true in the Washington Post, the CNN. It's a travesty. And then you go to the social platforms, Facebook, ex-Israeli spies running Facebook's, basically former Israeli military personnel who are part of Unit 8200 are now occupying the ranks of Facebook's governance boards that make decisions around what content is permissible on Facebook and Instagram.
Right.
So here we are. It's a true travesty of the mainstream media. Has been entirely complicit.
This is something really very alarming. And since you're a Jew yourself, you know what exactly Zionism is doing. I want to understand, how did the Zionists gather all this support from all over the world? I mean, they are being supported by people in media, they are being supported by the big political personalities of the world. How did they gather all this support?
Well, it's a fantastic question, and we could spend hours discussing it. But you have to remember, is an extension of um, Western imperial interests going all the way back to the 19th century, right? You have the Balfour Declaration itself. What was the point of the Balfour Declaration? It was to secure British interests in the Near East. Britain wanted a buffer zone on the Suez Canal. It wanted a resilient supply line to ship its oil from the Persian Gulf out the Haifa oil refinery. And so Britain wanted Palestine for the same reason it wanted Egypt, for the same reason it wanted India. It was an extension of its empire. And you could say the same was true for the United States in the Cold War. Again, the Cold War politics pushed the United States to support any country that it perceived to be its ally in the Cold War. And that, of course, included Israel, because Egypt and Syria were being supported by the Soviet Union. So there was geopolitical interests. I would say that's a major factor. But look, you have tens of millions of evangelical Americans who support Zionism for theological reasons, because they believe at the end of days the Jews will gather in the Holy Land, and if they don't accept Christ, they'll all burn in hell for all eternity. But again, these are based on religious beliefs. And then you could say, for various reasons, Jewish Zionists and non-Jewish Zionists have occupied critical roles in media organizations, as we've already talked about.
Yes.
You know, they've occupied critical roles in the U.S. Congress. And then, of course, you have they occupy critical roles in Hollywood, in big tech, in the VC world, in business. You know, Zionists, for various reasons, have risen to the very top of the economic and the business and the political echelons of this country.
Yes.
And then the final point I would make is the Zionist lobby itself, the AIPAC lobby, has been working diligently over many, many decades.
And since you are an expert in the history of Palestine, and when we study the history of Palestine, we see that during the older times, Muslims and Jews, they were living in peace in that area. How did the split between these two communities happen, and how did they become enemies?
Well, you're exactly correct. In the late Ottoman period, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, they lived in relative peace and harmony in Ottoman Palestine. You have anecdotes where Muslims are going on picnics together with Jews.
The Jews, yes.
In late Ottoman Palestine, celebrating Jewish holidays together at the shrine of Shimon HaTzadik in Sheikh Jarrah, where you had Jews and Muslims and Christians, you know, celebrating together. The same was true. Jews celebrated Ramadan together with Muslims. Muslims dressed up on the holiday of Purim and celebrated with Jews. You know, these things were commonplace in late Ottoman Palestine. They also all believed in this common ideology of Ottomanism, where religion was less important than the shared sense of Ottoman identity, which was all about loyalty to the Constitution, a free press, and these shared civic values. So you're exactly correct. And so the question is, what happened? Well, what happened was Zionism, because Zionism didn't believe in democracy. Zionism was a deeply anti-democratic movement, rejected any type of, you know, a constitution, rejected, you know, one person, one vote. Because if of course, one person, one vote would mean Jews would be in the minority, and,
Yes.
and thus there wouldn't be a Jewish state. So Zionism came and said, no, we believe in a Jewish state where Jews are supreme, which was profoundly anti-democratic. And so that is ultimately what led to the tension. It was Jews moving to Palestine and saying, we don't care about democracy. We don't support a democratic institutions or a constitution or a one person, one vote type of system. No, we support Jewish domination and Jewish supremacy in a land that is overwhelmingly non-Jewish. And of course that led to conflict.
Okay, and now this brings me to the concluding part of this interview. I want to discuss the term genocide. Like, if you ask me personally, I clearly believe that Israel is committing a genocide over here in Gaza, in Palestine. There are other people who also believe in this thing, that Israel is committing a genocide. But there are so many people who avoid using this term. There are so many political personalities, so many influential personalities who avoid using this term, genocide. So why do they avoid using this term? Isn't there a clear definition of genocide, and don't we all know what a genocide is?
Genocide is the legal term. that has been defined by the Genocide Convention of 1948, in which genocide is defined as the intent to destroy in whole or part an ethnic, racial, religious group. And then, in addition to the intent to destroy the group, there are also 5 acts that are labeled as genocidal acts in this 1948 Genocide Convention, including killing members of the group, preventing births within the group, making conditions of life impossible, and a few others. So yes, this is a legal term that is defined according to international law, and all member states of the United Nations are party to this treaty. And that is, of course, how it was the case that South Africa was able to bring Israel to the court,
Yes.
to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, which is the world's highest court. It's the UN court. And of course, they brought charges of genocide to this court, charging Israel with carrying out the crime of genocide. And the court just determined, was it already in January, February of 2024, that there was a plausible case to be made that Israel was carrying out genocide.
Yes.
And of course, we will know in the subsequent years, in the coming years, whether or not the court will determine that in fact genocide has been carried out. But already multiple UN institutions, the Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, as well as a number of other UN institutions, have already come out and said genocidal acts are being carried out in Gaza, as have many hundreds of legal experts, historians of genocide, scholars of international law. They've all come out and said what we are witnessing is, if not a risk of genocide, outright genocide, including Israeli scholars of genocide, like Omar Bentov, who says that the operation being carried out in the north of Gaza today is obviously a genocide, where they're going door to door and literally murdering people in their homes who refuse to leave.
Yes, and the world is not realizing that this whole situation is clearly a genocide. Finally, my final question: are you hopeful? Are you hopeful about international justice in this whole case, in this whole scenario?
Well, the ICJ has come to the conclusion in previous cases that genocidal acts took place among the Rohingya, in Bosnia, in Rwanda. So there's many precedents for the ICJ to come to this conclusion. So I'm certainly hopeful, but
Time will tell. Time will tell. Thank you, Dr. Zachary Foster. You gave us some great insights about this whole situation, about the history of Palestine and Israel, and about the genocide being committed these days.